The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
Everyone thinks they know the story of Princess Diana's estate. The world's most photographed woman, a princess who had danced at the White House and walked through minefields, died suddenly at the age of 36 in a Paris tunnel on August 31, 1997. Within days, people were placing flowers outside Kensington Palace by the millions. Within weeks, the world had mourned together in a way it had never quite done before. And then, like clockwork, came the question that always follows the death of a great figure. What did she leave behind? And who did she leave it to? The official answer sounded clean enough. Her estate was valued by the High Court of Justice of England at £21,711,485 more than $30 million US. After inheritance taxes, that figure dropped to roughly £12 to £13 million net. Her sons, William and Harry, were named as the primary beneficiaries. Her 17 godchildren were remembered. Even her butler, Paul Burrell, received a bequest. Simple, proper, royal. That was not simple at all, because behind the official numbers and the neatly typed legal documents, there was a far more human story, one involving a secret letter that was kept hidden for years, a court-approved alteration that Diana never sanctioned, godchildren who were cheated out of what she had intended for them, a butler dragged into one of the most dramatic criminal trials of the early 2000s, and 2 young princes who waited 17 years before they could fully receive what their mother had left them. The story of Princess Diana's estate is not just a legal document, it is the last chapter of her rebellion, played out in courtrooms and auction houses, in memoir pages and memorial exhibitions, long after she was gone. And at the center of all of it stood one person, a person so unexpected, so improbable, that the very idea of their role shocked an entire nation. Let us start from the beginning and follow every thread. To understand what Diana did with her estate, you first have to understand who she had become by the time she wrote it. She had arrived on the world stage at 20 years old, quiet and almost painfully unassuming, working as a kindergarten aide when she began her courtship with Prince Charles. When she walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981, somewhere around 750 million people watched. Her wedding dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, featured a 25-foot train that remains the longest in British royal wedding history. The world did not simply watch a wedding. It watched what felt like the beginning of a fairy tale that a cold, formal monarchy had rarely offered. What followed behind the palace doors was something very different. Charles had never entirely ended his emotional attachment to Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana later spoke publicly about knowing that something was wrong even before the wedding. She developed bulimia nervosa, a private battle she would eventually bring into the open as a way of reclaiming honesty in a world that prized silence. The marriage deteriorated through the 1980s under a facade of royal normalcy, and when the Camillagate tapes emerged in 1992, revealing intimate phone calls between Charles and Camilla, the illusion collapsed for the entire world to see. A formal separation was announced that same year. But instead of retreating, Diana did something almost unprecedented for a member of the royal family. In November 1995, she sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for a BBC Panorama interview and spoke about the marriage, about Camilla, about her mental health, about feeling that the establishment had wanted her to disappear. An estimated 23 million people watched it in the United Kingdom alone. She was calm, precise, and devastating. The bashful young woman in the ivory silk dress had transformed into something the palace had no framework to contain. And then she channeled that transformation outward. At the Middlesex Hospital in 1987, she had shaken hands without gloves with an AIDS patient at a time when public fear of the disease was still rooted in dangerous ignorance. She said plainly, "HIV does not make people dangerous to know. You can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it." The act was photographed and distributed around the world, and it shifted something in how ordinary people thought about the epidemic. In January 1997, she traveled to Angola with the Halo Trust, walking carefully through a minefield, wearing a protective visor and flak jacket, bringing global cameras with her. The photographs ran on front pages everywhere. Months later, the Ottawa Mine Ban Treaty was signed by 122 countries, opening for signatures in December 1997. James Cowan, CEO of the Halo Trust, has credited Diana directly with the success of that treaty. In recognition of her philanthropic impact, Stephen Lee, then director of the UK Institute of Charity Fundraising Managers, said in 2011 that Diana's overall effect on charity is probably more significant than any other person's in the 20th century. She was, by 1996, one of the most powerful private citizens on Earth, and technically, she was now a private citizen. The divorce was finalized that year. She lost her HRH title. She was no longer a working royal, but she was something the palace could not strip away: a global moral voice with genuine public trust. It was in this context, in the summer of 1993, and with a codicil in 1996, that she sat down to decide what would happen when she was gone. Princess Diana signed her last will and testament on June 1, 1993. She amended it with a codicil in 1996, after her divorce. The document was straightforward in structure, but meaningful in its details. She appointed her mother, the Honorable Frances Ruth Shaw Kidd, and Commander Patrick Jepson, her private secretary at the time, as her original executors. The codicil later replaced Jepson's role with her sister, the Lady Elizabeth Sarah Lavinia McCorquodale. A third executor, the Bishop of London, Richard Chartres, was added by order of the High Court of Justice after Diana's death. The will directed that the residue of her estate, everything left after debts, taxes, and specific bequests, were settled, be held in trust, and divided equally between Prince William and Prince Henry, known as Harry, available to them when each reached the age of 25. Paul Burrell, who had served as Diana's personal butler and had been deeply loyal to her through the most turbulent years of her life, received a bequest of £50,000, the equivalent of approximately $80,000 at the time. It was a sum that clearly reflected how much she valued him. Sentimental items such as photographs, paintings, and china were directed toward her 17 godchildren. And then Diana did something that many estate planning lawyers now study as a cautionary lesson. The day after signing her will, she composed a separate document called a Letter of Wishes, a non-legally binding letter intended to guide her executors on the distribution of her personal belongings. In that letter, she requested that 75% of her jewelry and personal chattels be passed to William and Harry, with the hope reportedly expressed in the letter that their future wives would one day wear her pieces. The remaining 25% of her chattels was to be distributed among her 17 godchildren. It was a genuine and generous intention. Each godchild's share would have been worth, conservatively, around £100,000, but the Letter of Wishes contained language that would prove fatally ambiguous. Diana used words like discretion and wishes rather than mandatory legal directives. Under British law, that language gave her executors latitude to interpret or to ignore the letter as they saw fit. Diana could not have known that this legal gap would matter. She did not expect to die at 36. On August 31, 1997, Diana was killed in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. Henri Paul, the driver, had a blood alcohol level later found to be more than 3 times the French legal limit. The Princess of Wales, along with Dodi Fayed, died at the scene. Her bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, was the only survivor. The coroner at the 2007 Paris inquest, Lord Justice Scott Baker, concluded that the deaths were the result of grossly negligent driving by Henri Paul and the pursuing paparazzi. Within 4 months of her death, something happened in a quiet courtroom in England that almost no one noticed at the time. In December 1997, Diana's mother and sister, now her executors, went to probate court and obtained what is known as a variation order. This legal instrument allowed them to alter the terms of how Diana's estate would be distributed. The changes they made were significant. First, William and Harry would not receive their full shares of the estate at 25, as Diana had specified. Instead, the age was raised to 30, although they could begin receiving interest from the trust at 25. This meant that all of Diana's physical belongings could be held in limbo for an additional 5 years beyond what she had intended. Second, Diana's 17 godchildren would not receive the 25% share of her personal chattels described in her letter of wishes. Instead, each godchild would receive a single memento, chosen by the executors, when Harry turned 30. Some who received those items described them as a tacky memento, rather than the meaningful inheritance Diana had intended. Each godchild's share, had the letter been honored, would have been worth approximately £100,000. The parents of the godchildren were not notified before the variation was sought. They did not know about Diana's letter of wishes until years later, when the story broke through an entirely unrelated court case. When they found out, many of them were shocked and outraged. Their children had been quietly disinherited from a significant portion of their intended inheritance, and it had been done in secret. Why did Diana's mother and sister pursue this variance? The full reasoning has never been publicly explained. Some have suggested they were protecting William and Harry by ensuring the princes received the full collection of personal property, rather than 3/4. Others have noted that because the distribution age was raised to 30, Diana's entire collection of 150 items, including her legendary wedding dress, 28 other gowns, personal letters, jewelry, photographs, and home movies could be held and displayed publicly for 17 years. That is precisely what happened. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, took custody of the collection. It traveled the world as part of an exhibition called Diana: A Celebration, displayed at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, for 2 months every year, and loaned to museums in the United States and elsewhere for the other 10 months. By 2011, the collection had raised over $2 million for charities in Diana's name, but none of this had been what Diana's letter of wishes had described. In March 2012, William turned 30 and received approximately £10 million, his half of the residuary estate. In September 2014, Harry turned 30 and received his matching £10 million. 17 years after their mother's death, the two princes finally had what she had left them. Paul Burrell had worked for the royal family for many years before becoming Diana's personal butler. He had served the Queen herself before moving into Diana's household, where he became a fixture of her daily life. He carried her bags, managed her schedule, and sat with her in the kitchen during the long, lonely nights when the palace felt most suffocating. She called him, reportedly, her rock, and in her will, she expressed that trust financially with a £50,000 bequest, a meaningful and personal gift. But Burrell's real connection to Diana's estate story goes far beyond that bequest. In 2001, 4 years after Diana's death, police raided Burrell's home in Cheshire, England. Inside, they discovered 310 items that had belonged to Diana: royal gowns, letters, private photographs of William and Harry as children, personal notes, home videos, and more. He was charged with theft. The trial began in 2002 and quickly became one of the most dramatic legal spectacles the country had seen. The prosecution argued that Burrell had never told anyone he was holding the items, and that this constituted theft from Diana's estate. Then, in a moment that stopped the courtroom cold, it emerged that Burrell had, in fact, told someone. Shortly after Diana's death, he had requested a private audience with Queen Elizabeth II. In that meeting, which lasted approximately 1.5 hours, he told the Queen that he was holding several of Diana's possessions for safekeeping. The Queen remembered the conversation. She had mentioned it to Prince Charles, and the prosecution's entire case built on the premise that Burrell had told no one collapsed. All 3 charges were dropped. Burrell walked free. But the aftermath was nearly as turbulent as the trial. In 2003, Burrell published a memoir titled A Royal Duty, in which he shared intimate details about Diana's private life, her fears, her relationships, and the contents of letters she had written. One letter, which he claimed Diana had written to him, alleged that Prince Charles was planning an accident in my car. The book provoked a furious reaction from William and Harry, who released a rare public statement describing Burrell's revelations as a deeply painful and cold and overt betrayal that would mortify our mother if she were alive today. They asked him publicly to stop. Burrell has continued to speak and write about Diana in the years since. For many people, he remains a deeply controversial figure, someone who received Diana's trust and her money, and who spent the subsequent decades trading on her memory in ways she could not have anticipated or approved. For others, he represents something more complicated, a man who genuinely loved the woman he served, who tried to protect her things when the palace felt threatening, and who found himself caught between loyalty and survival. Whatever one makes of Paul Burrell, his role in the story of Diana's estate is undeniable. The trial that cleared him was the same legal proceeding that revealed the secret variation of her will to the godchildren's families. His books kept her story alive in the public consciousness, and the £50,000 she left him was not simply money. It was a recognition written in ink, in the will she signed herself, that he had mattered to her. Beyond Burrell, beyond the godchildren, and beyond the legal maneuvering, the real heart of Diana's estate was always about William and Harry. She wrote in her will that she wanted her brother Earl Spencer to be appointed as guardian of her children should she die while they were still minors, alongside her mother. She expressed the wish without placing anyone under any binding obligation, as the will phrased it, that Charles would consult with her mother regarding the upbringing and welfare of their sons. These were the words of a woman who loved her children beyond anything else, and who worried, even in the language of a legal document, about their futures. For 17 years, William and Harry grew up without the money or the personal possessions their mother had left them. The interest from the trust helped. The exhibitions of her belongings raised money for charity. But the full weight of their inheritance, financial and symbolic, did not arrive until they each turned 30. When Harry received his share in 2014, he later spoke publicly about what it meant. In a 2021 conversation with Oprah Winfrey, he said directly, "I've got all my mom left me, and without that, we would not have been able to do this," referring to his decision to step back from royal duties and relocate to California with Meghan Markle. Diana's money, held in trust for 17 years longer than she had intended, eventually became the financial foundation that allowed her younger son to build a life outside the institution she had so publicly clashed with. William, as the heir to the throne, has channeled much of his inherited responsibility into public service. He took over Diana's patronage of Centrepoint, the homeless youth charity she had championed. Together with Harry and Catherine, he helped establish the Royal Foundation, which in 2013 formally took over the legal ownership of the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, ensuring that the causes she had championed, palliative care, landmine removal, refugee support, mental health, would continue to receive attention and resources. Diana had hoped, in a letter she wrote alongside her will, that her jewelry would eventually be worn by the women her sons married. That wish at least came true in ways she could not have scripted. William proposed to Catherine Middleton using Diana's sapphire and diamond engagement ring, the ring that had once sat on Diana's own hand on that July morning in 1981. Catherine has since been photographed wearing Diana's tiara and sapphire earrings. Meghan Markle, in her and Harry's emotional 2021 interview with Oprah, wore Diana's diamond Cartier bracelet. The jewelry traveled forward through time, just as Diana had wanted, even if nothing else went exactly as planned. On the day Diana died, the public grief was immediate and overwhelming. People brought flowers to Kensington Palace in such quantities